for coming. It's kind of hard to believe that it's been 5 years since I stood up here and presented my own paper, but I am very honored to be here tonight with such a strong set of papers. I just want to get the conversation started. So go ahead. Whether through their recounting of personal histories or public events, each of tonight's presenters demonstrates a clear understanding of what historian E.H. Carr termed the reciprocal process of history making. According to Carr, both the process of deconstructing dominant historical narratives and reconstructing them in light of the historical present relies on the historian's ability to determine first the discursive norms of the socio-historical context she is studying, and then those of the context she herself is working through. The historian, in her rewriting of the past, is then faced with the difficult task of assessing and untangling the competing and often contradictory narratives that shape our personal, regional, and national histories. Tonight, whether it is an author's rewriting of self and region that exposes the paradoxical and ultimately exclusionary nature of expansionist narratives, the mass misinterpretation of political views that rendered a first-wave feminist invisible to a history she herself helped forge, or the conflicting accounts of a race riot that left 35 dead and exposed the ugly truth of America's war at home. Tonight's presentations demonstrate that the process of history making begins at the very moment an historical event occurs, as private, public, and individual interests compete for narrative authority over their respective presence. From major publishing houses to mainstream, upstart independent, or ethnic presses, nowhere is this initial battle for narrative authority more evident than within the mediated public sphere. Tonight's presentations highlight the role this public contest plays in the construction of historical narratives. And even while each story has its own set of unique subjects and circumstances, each analysis demonstrates just how powerful the process of definition or redefinition is to the initial construction of a historical narrative. In the examination of Frances Fuller Victor's literary transformations, we are given detailed insight into the personal, political, and sociocultural factors that affected Victor's extraordinary, if often overlooked, literary career in a 19th century dominated by expansionist and ultimately masculine national narratives. As Alexis demonstrates, Victor's attempt to rewrite her own history while defining the mental and moral structure of the Northwest reflects her struggle to reconcile the disparate elements of her own identity as much as her struggle to reconcile the contradictory impulses in American expansionist narratives in general. Indeed, as the ambitious, self-assured Victor applied the tenets of manifest destiny to her own life and her project of civilizing the Northwest, the very ethic she engaged also relegated her literary transformations to the periphery of Northwest history, as male publishers denied her authorship. But even as we recognize the role Bancroft and other publishers played in stopping Victor from fulfilling her literary destiny, with our historical perspective, we might also contextualize Victor's poetical privilege and civilizing project by comparing strategies other women throughout history have used to publicly navigate, successfully or not, the rhetoric of the male-dominated fields in which they work. Frances Fuller Victor's story demonstrates, perhaps more than any tonight, that wielding the pen is only half the narrative battle in the process of making history. And while the failure of Victor's literary transformations to reach a wider audience can be at least partially attributed to the publishing industry's denial of her authorship, we see in Kelsey's recovery of first-wave feminist Victoria Woodhull that direct control over the means of media production by no means ensures a self-defined, uncontested historical narrative. Although Woodhull had the funding and public platform to define and promote her ideas on social freedom, the Woodhull and Claflin Weekly ultimately lost the media battle to the mainstream press, and Woodhull's ideas on free love as a natural right were effectively reframed to confirm the public's worst anxieties and fears about women's fight for equality. As Kelsey showed us, Tom Nash's cartoon drew from Woodhull's personal and political history to reframe her positions as a threat to the integrity of American institutions, doing irreparable damage to her public image in the process. And what may be of interest to the contemporary reader is not necessarily the vast differences between the mediated political battles of Woodhill's time and today, though I'm sure Woodhill's detractors would have been in awe of the ability to distribute a political cartoon to millions with a simple tweet or Facebook post. But that in the formation of popular political discourse, negative media campaigns have remained a relatively consistent and powerful tool. In further study, it may be productive to assess more explicitly why the mediation of Woodhill's rhetoric failed when others like Anthony's, though by no means uncontested, were eventually authorized, as this would shed some light on the process of constructing an oppositional identity within the many arenas of public discourse. Tonight's final paper is a dramatic example of the mass-mediated battle for narrative authority that initially defines the popularly accepted truth of an historical event. Bridget's assessment of the opposing and contradictory narratives of the Detroit race riot of 1943 suggests that police, the governor's fact-finding commission, and the mainstream press in Detroit inaccurately reported the events, effectively rewriting the story of the riot in an attempt to manage public perception and response. This officially authorized account highlighted not the escalation of violence by a white mob and the brutality of a racist police force, but the irresponsibility of the ethnic press and black leaders who agitated young hoodlums to violence. These official statements betray a paternalist ethic that has informed prevailing white attitudes toward calls for racial equality for generations, a paternalist narrative that was easily engaged in the public sphere to frame reports so that the public would understand black leaders and participants were the riot's true aggressors. In further study, it would be very worthwhile to investigate whether city officials directly pressured local media to frame the events in this manner, or if local reports were merely reflected the official narrative and the sort of general racial bias of the population. Given the contemporary reader's familiarity with police inaction and brutality throughout many eras of American history, we are perhaps not as surprised by the events of the riot or the spin that the governor's report and Detroit newspapers put on them, as we are by the overwhelming response from the national mainstream and ethnic press to publicly contest the official account and formulate an alternative narrative of the riot that held the mayor and the Detroit Police Department accountable for their role in first allowing and then escalating the violence. This strong alternative response should remind us, even as we grow increasingly cynical of the truthiness in today's media, that media is also the platform through which false narratives are publicly contested and ultimately exposed. Tonight's historical reconstructions underscore the power of definition and narrative authority in the construction of shared knowledge and its dissemination through mass media, which in contemporary time holds a seemingly infinite capacity to both obscure and shed light on the people, events, and discourses that shape our experience and understanding of the world. Today, the torrent of images and narrative voices that inundate our daily lives may make determining the truth in any story overwhelming, if not impossible. But this very fact suggests that now more than ever, our society needs the thoughtful mediation of the historian to assess and reconstruct the historical narratives that so significantly shape our present. Before we go ahead and move on to our question and answer session, I just want to commend each of you for your diligent close reading of the primary and secondary documents that drove your research. Truly, you guys had a phenomenal group of papers tonight that I hope, as Ryan takes us off into discussion, will provide an interesting discussion. Things for you guys to think about as you move forward with your studies. So, great job.
I'd also like to congratulate you guys on 3 very excellent papers. Make it very easy to ask questions when you have such interesting papers to read through. Alexis, do you think the image of the Pacific Northwest that Victor strive to create included her embrace or contest the masculine structure of power?
I think Victor's biggest problem with, or why she was so involved with the feminist or women's movement was because of the effect it had on herself. Herself as a woman, she was put down and put underneath men in society, and she felt that she should be able to rise above that. So I feel like that is her largest component as to why she is so focused on this feminist movement and why it's a big part of her life. So in that sense, it is a part of the Pacific Northwest identity, in that anyone, regardless of their gender, should be able to live up to their abilities and qualifications.
Kelsey, in what manner do you think will influence perceptions of the women's rights during her time? Although you did comment that she seemed to think that history would absolve her, but at her time, what do you think the public, her actions did to influence public perceptions?
I think it depended. She spoke in a lot of places during that tour I mentioned after she published her story and got arrested. And I had the opportunity to read some of the commentaries that were published in the town journals. She actually visited my hometown, which I was really excited about. And a lot of the responses were that at first they were like, I don't know about this woman, she seems too much. She was part of the communist movement pretty heavily for a little while there. I mean, she had the free love thing going on, she had spiritualism, she was, if not nationally known, at least she was kind of infamous. And after people would go see her, they were actually extraordinarily impressed by what they heard. She was well known as a very, very good public speaker. And so I think if you hadn't seen her, you had this different perception than when you actually went and heard her ideas, because often I think kind of today you get misquoted or you have the sound bites, and so you have that I have an inalienable right to do this. But I think for those who actually got to see her speak and hear her in person, she actually did have a positive influence on how women should be perceived and how women should be respected in society. However, in the general aspect of what was going on, she did kind of hurt the movement to some aspect of just this thing she was standing for and the movement she was running for and running for president and stuff. So I think it depended on whether you had seen her from the outside or whether you actually went and saw her speak. So
Just the current material of her message seems like it would make it very easy for the media to put a negative spin on it.
very much.
Bridget, in your research, did you find that the media influenced public opinion surrounding the riots, or do you think it reflected the legitimate general sentiment of the public?
Can you say the question one more time?
Yeah, just in your research, did you find that the media portrayed an accurate account of the public's perception of the riots, or do you feel that the media itself actually swayed public opinion?
I think that the media did have some accuracy to it, in the sense that many of what the media published was what people were feeling and how they were feeling. But I also feel like the aims of the government to focus on the war instead of racial equality downplay the truth behind what the media was saying, and the fact that it really was people really were feeling this way, and that there was a lot of racial issues, a lot of racial tensions, and so I do think it was accurate representation in the media.
Thank you, Ryan, for your initial questions, Alysse for your commentary, and all three of you for wonderful papers. I would like to open up the discussion to anyone who may have a question for any presenter or all of the presenters. Dr. Eastman.
Well, I also really enjoyed all the papers. I was familiar with 2 of them, but I thought they were wonderful, and thanks to Alysse for the comments. I'd also like to invoke Edward Hallett Carr, as Alysse did, who urged us to, if you want to know the history, to know the historian. So I'd love to just start out by asking, what got you interested in such fascinating subjects, and what kind of keeps your interest? Obviously, you've pursued this a long way down the road here. So how did you, trace your steps backward? How did you originally find these subjects?
Sure. I was in a selected topics racial violence class, discussed the history of racial violence, and one of the articles we read was about this, or it wasn't even about the Detroit riot. It mentioned the Detroit riot as another riot that took place during World War II. And when I saw the numbers and statistics of injuries, arrests, and deaths, I was baffled by the fact that I didn't know this, being a history minor, American Studies major. How could this be such a big part of history? And World War II, which I have a weird fascination for, that how did I not know this? So that was initially was kind of got me started on it. But then the fact that there's kind of mystery in history and the told stories of the people, and it's all kind of fascinating to me how something so monumental in history can go by so, fly by so unknown to other people. So that's where I got started.
Mine was History 400, and it was a biography study of Dr. Dugan. And so we had to pick a person, and so I naturally tend towards Queen Elizabeth, but that gets chosen a lot, so I got denied right away. So I wanted to write about a woman just because women's history interests me just as a woman myself. And so it was literally a Google search of American women, and it just brought me to a list. And the first one to stand out to me was Carrie Chapman Catt. She was also a feminist, and she was also a Pi Beta Phi, which is maturity. And then I clicked on Victoria Woodhull, and I just kind of started reading about her, and she is ridiculous. When you first, she ran for president in 1872, and then she was a free lover, and called Mrs. Satan. I'm like, okay, what is this person? This is absolutely not normal. And so that's just kind of how I started, and just, I always find out new things about her. Dr. Fire can attest to this. And so it's just been so easy for her to keep my interest, because she left field all the time. So it's been an interesting ride, I guess.
My paper, as the others, originated in History 400 with Dr. LaBelle, and it was early American travel narratives. And I think we can all attest to the power of Google with this, because mine essentially was early American travel narratives, and I came up with Frances Fuller Victor and several of the books that she had written. And I knew I kind of wanted to focus on the Pacific Northwest just because that's where I was born and raised and have a long history myself there. So it really just fit perfectly, and she has taken me for quite a few loops. She's very interesting and quite the personality. So it's just finding new things about her, and the things that she was involved with have really kept me interested.
Dr. Jordan. Well, this one's for Bridget, and I wondered, given that this is a more recent time period, if you had the opportunity to find anyone or be able to speak with anyone from that time period that actually was a part of the Detroit riots?
I have not. I did start this from History 400 basically, but it was only last semester, and there's only so much time that you have for research before it's actually time to turn in a final draft. I wish that I would have, and if I had more time, which I might try to do that, but for the most part, I found a lot of difficulties actually working with the Detroit libraries and their research departments, getting a hold of them. So I worked mostly through the University of Chicago library and what they had from the riot, and I unfortunately was not able to find any witnesses to the riot. I have a couple quotes quotes that I found in articles, but it's mostly just about the prejudices that the whites felt towards working with blacks in the labor force.
Bridget, mine's also for you. You alluded to, you mentioned there were other riots at the time during the war. Were there any sympathy riots after this, the Detroit riot that you found with, I mean, Thurgood Marshall, this made national press. Did you find in any other cities where blacks took to the streets to say, you know, with the same unrest that's connected to Detroit, or were all these other riots that took place really self-contained?
I don't want to say that they were self-contained, but I'm going to go ahead and say that because America didn't want them to be known, they tried as hard as they can to make them seem unconnected. So it would be very hard for me to prove that, you know, incidents that happened in Chicago 8 weeks later was a result of this, because there was so much kind of like downplay towards the riot that it's very possible that they're connected uprisings, but I do not know for sure.
Thank you.
I have a question for Alexis. What a fascinating woman. I mean, this is sort of a long way from my area, but her project sounds so overwhelmingly Orientalist, but not in the Orient, right? I mean, she's doing ethnology, she's looking at environment, she's obsessed with savages. I was wondering, usually in accounts of that type, she sets herself up as a translator, right? She's going to translate this stuff with people in the East, and then they're going to come to understand what the West is. Usually in this, there's sort of implicit references to her credentials to be able to do this translation. And I was wondering, I mean, because it's sort of an odd intersection for feminists. She could translate on behalf of women, but what makes her think that she can translate for Easterners on behalf of the West, or make the West speak through her?
That's really interesting. Okay. Well, I think where she gains most of her confidence comes back to her earlier years, because she started writing when she was like 9, and she was getting her poems published. And so her family, there's not a lot on her early history and background, but I would assume that that's where most of this came from. She was obviously very supported and very encouraged in all of her endeavors. And so I would argue that that's where her confidence comes from. But as far as her credentials as to what she thinks, I think essentially she just doesn't really understand why because she's on the same level as men in these literary circles that she's working with, and she's producing the same level of quality work, and so I think she's just really frustrated with that. And so I don't know, I think it's just kind of like this innate feeling or notion that she can and she will and she wants to. Other than that, I can't 100% say, because she doesn't explicitly vocalize these things. Another part that going through her, she's very like abstract in all of her writing. She doesn't really say too many concrete sentences like I am Frances Fuller Victor and this is what I believe. It's all these sort of like literary allusions and creative whatever. So it's just really interesting. So I'm not exactly 100% sure where or what she believes her, or how her experiences qualify her, but she's obviously very firm in that.
Does she make reference a lot to her experience like in Nebraska? I mean, does that kind of qualify her as a pseudo-Westerner where she can recognize things?
Sort of. She had a really negative experience in Nebraska, and she absolutely hated it. And she was like, totally.
How is that possible?
Right? But she really did not like it at all. So I think if anything, her experiences in Nebraska kind of, I guess, with her husband and all the forces that she was having to fight against, really probably evoked that sense that she was fighting against things that she thought was right.
Dr. McHugh.
I have a question for Kelsey. I was just curious, I felt paper that you were arguing that in fact Victoria Woodhull and her goals were consonant with first wave feminism. Do you really think she wanted to join that club? I mean, I feel like she was such an amazing person. She really transcended any, I guess, names or groups. Did you feel like you were trying to get her back into a corner where she herself wanted to be?
I was actually literally thinking about this afternoon. I think she liked to join things. So I think she would have been okay with adding that to like her list of stuff. But I don't think she would have been content being known as just a first wave feminist. I guess I more wanted to approach it like I want her to be remembered, because so much of what's written about today is the weirder aspects of her life, like her ridiculous family and like her spiritualism, free love, and all this stuff. And I kind of want to take it back to like, at the base of it, she was like a woman who supported women's rights and did all of this. So do I think she would have defined herself that way explicitly? No. Just because she was also a communist, she was president of the Spiritualist Association in America, like she was a eugenicist. She was all of these things, and I think that would have been another way to define herself, but not explicitly. So I don't want to back her into a corner, but I want to put her back where she isn't, I guess, today.
Let's see if I can get this out. This is for Alexis. I was thinking about what Professor Hawkins was saying. I think one of the things that comes to mind is that the truest Westerner is the one who is there to participate in and witness the transformation. Okay, so that may be some of what she claims as her, the power of her authenticity, what it comes from, her ability to translate. Although it's odd, this is what I'm trying to remember back from your presentation, is because she claims, she had a statement that you shared with us about her authenticity coming from her arrival in 1865 or whatever, how she was there, which was really interesting to me because that means she actually missed some really important stuff in Oregon. She wasn't there during the peak years of the Oregon Trail period, when the people were arriving and settling in her beloved Willamette Valley. Right. Okay. She wasn't there for the Road River War. Where the native peoples of Western Oregon were sent to reservations. I mean, she missed a lot of that. So then she has to claim friendship with people like the Applegates, the pioneer family. So she actually missed some pretty important stuff. I mean, so that's kind of interesting, I think. So just that's my comment. My question to you was about where did she get this idea of political privilege? You have this in quotation marks, and so where did this idea come from?
Well, kind of an interesting little insight that I didn't learn about until maybe like a week ago. I thought originally that she had coined this term herself, that she, in her, literary awesomeness, just came up with it. But it turns out that it was actually, I can't remember, is it Sir Walter Scott had wrote about this term in like way back when, and he talks about it in very similar senses as she does. So this unique ability that she has to translate these happenings into literary works that illuminate great things that people otherwise wouldn't get. So it's actually, and I'm kind of, going through my last draft of the paper and adding that in, because I think it's really important and really interesting and kind of backs everything up that because I was previously using this term poetical privilege as like an abstract idea that she had come up with, and now it's kind of, good to hear that it's actually used before and it's not something that she just made up, so.
That tends to happen, by the way, when research is getting to go, right?
Yeah.
Here comes another key piece of information.
I have a question for Kelsey. Alysse kind of talked about this, the dialogue that occurs within the media that kind of forms our historical perception of an event. And you talked about Woodhull's, she actually had a newspaper herself. So do you think she went about that as a kind of a proactive solution to knowing that having these radical ideas, she was going to have to take part in this, big fight to the death over, her legacy pretty much, or do you think that was more of a retaliatory thing from things that she had experienced in the past?
I wouldn't say it's retaliatory just because she hadn't started before a lot of like the negative press started flying in. I think in part it was because Democracies told her she was going to have a newspaper. She put a lot of stock in spirit guides, which I talk about in the longer paper. But I think it was honestly just so she could say her opinions in the way she wanted to. She contributed to it. Her sister did. Various other writers. Her husband was the editor of the newspaper. So I think it was also just a way to get her ideas out there as a politician. And then as the popular press started to come at her, it was also a way to kind of like rebel and still get out what she actually wanted to say, not what they were like spinning of it. So I think it had like a multitude. It went through like several variations of what it talked about and what it didn't talk about, but I think it was just, feminists have already had like their own newspaper. I don't know the title of it, but like it was just